At San Francisco International Airport, what seemed like an ordinary morning suddenly became the starting point of an unexpected incident. One born from silence, judgmental glances, and a boarding pass torn as if it had never held any value. Danielle Moore, a black woman dressed simply in a black tie shirt, jeans, and sneakers, stepped into the first-class cabin of Aerostar's flight to New York. She did not carry the aura of a CEO or the pride of a billionaire shareholder. Instead, she chose to appear as an ordinary passenger, unassuming, unpretentious. But it was precisely that appearance that others used as an excuse to dismiss her, not because of her actions or qualifications, but purely out of prejudice. Becky Thompson, the head flight attendant, a white woman around 35, known for her strictness and her insistence on the proper image of first class, approached with a cold stare and a tone no less judgmental. "First class is not for people like you," Becky said, her voice soft as a feather, but carrying the heavy weight of a hammer striking anyone standing in that spot. Without waiting for Danielle to respond or explain, Becky snatched the boarding pass from her hand and tore it apart in front of dozens of silent onlookers. The torn paper fell to the carpet like a wordless declaration. "Here, you are not accepted." What Becky did not realize was that the woman she had just publicly humiliated held 25% ownership of the very airline she worked for, a person not only influential in strategic development, but also the ultimate authority behind every internal cultural decision. Danielle Moore, 42 years old, is not only one of America's most successful entrepreneurs, but also a quiet symbol of fairness and integrity in a business environment full of barriers. For years, she has strived to change perceptions about how black people are viewed in spaces traditionally not meant for them. And today, as her boarding pass was torn, she understood that her suspicions about discrimination within the very airline she helped build were entirely justified. Danielle did not resist. She did not show anger. She simply stood there, silent, but with eyes that were anything but weak. Those were the eyes of someone fully aware of her true place and who understands that sometimes, to see the full truth, one must be stripped down to their very dignity. And in that moment, everything changed, not just for her, but for Aerostar as a whole. Flight AS-417 from San Francisco to New York that morning was supposed to be just another routine journey in Aerostar's packed schedule. But for Danielle Moore, it was far from random. It was a test, a quiet mission to shine a light on the very organization she had helped build over more than a decade. Recent complaints reaching the board about discrimination, hostile glances, and disrespectful words regularly endured by black passengers were no longer vague rumors. They carried a weight of unease and challenge, stirring Danielle, the head of human resources strategy and corporate culture development, to rise from her glass office and stop merely reading reports. Danielle didn't believe in endless meetings or PR plans drafted by people who had never felt the sting of cold, dismissive looks. She understood that some truths couldn't be grasped through charts or numbers. She needed to see with her own eyes, to feel with the sensitivity of someone who had once been a victim of the very system she now sought to change. So instead of sending investigators or service evaluators, she chose to step into the role of an anonymous passenger, buying a ticket under her real name, but keeping her identity hidden. That morning, She left the hotel carrying none of the accessories that would reveal her status. No luxury watch, no designer bag, no assistant in tow. Just a middle-aged woman with calm eyes and steady steps. It wasn't mere humility, but a deliberate choice. She wanted to become someone else in the eyes of her own staff, to clearly see how they truly treated those without power. What Danielle did not expect was the blatant nature of the discrimination she would face. Not a silent undercurrent, but an openly cruel act, witnessed by many. A silent slap in words and actions from a system she had once believed was reformed. And in that moment, when her first-class ticket was torn apart, she realized her suspicions were not just true. They were the symptom of a deeply rooted disease. She hadn't come here to be angry. She came to confront. And she knew everything must change, starting right here in first class. Aerostar's first-class cabin was designed to impress. Every detail exuded just the right amount of luxury, understated yet clearly superior to the rest of the plane. Soft golden ceiling lights, plush cream leather seats, and a subtle aroma of sandalwood essential oil filled the space. Most passengers, business people, politicians, and the elite wore the confident air typical of those accustomed to privilege. Danielle entered this scene with calm eyes, but each step seemed to stir an invisible wave. Before she could even sit down, she was stopped. Becky Thompson, her uniform impeccably pressed, golden hair neatly tied up, and a cold gaze stood blocking the aisle. Without checking her name or seat number, Becky looked Danielle up and down with unmasked judgment. "First class is not for people like you," she said, her voice not loud but echoing clearly in the silence, causing even those reading or typing to look up. It wasn't merely a refusal of a seat, it was a verdict, a stereotype that boxed the woman before her as not belonging here. Danielle said nothing. She tilted her head slightly, pulled her boarding pass from her jacket, and patiently held it out to Becky. No one in the cabin knew that ticket was purchased with the company account, of which Danielle was the largest shareholder. No one knew that she had approved the entire flight attendant training budget for this very airline. But Becky cared nothing for these facts. She didn't even look at the ticket, just smirked, then decisively snatched the paper from Danielle's hand and tore it in two. The sound of ripping echoed through the cabin like a sharp slap, breaking the prolonged silence. Some passengers gasped. Others looked down, avoiding Danielle's eyes, as if their silence could absolve them of any involvement. Becky stood tall, wielding power in her pettiness. But what she didn't realize was that those torn pieces of paper falling onto the carpet were more than just a boarding pass. They were the end of her career, the death of the arrogant culture Aerostar had clung to as a polished facade. At the center of it all, Danielle remained silent. No anger, no panic. Just eyes, deep, sharp, and carrying a promise. Everything was about to change. Not because she had been insulted, but because if the truth could be buried even in first class, far graver things surely existed in places no one wanted to see. The ripping sound of the boarding pass still echoed in the minds of the witnesses when a new face appeared. Jake Willis, a young male flight attendant about 28 years old, approached with a mocking smile briefly flashing on his lips. His eyes betrayed contempt as they swept over Danielle, as if her presence in this space was an absurdity too hard to accept. "You really think just wearing a T-shirt, sneakers, and acting normal lets you walk in here?" Jake's voice was low but filled with scorn, deliberately loud enough for nearby Rose to hear clearly. "Next time, if you want to pretend to be rich, at least invest a little more." Danielle remained silent. She simply looked at both Jake and Becky, not with anger or disdain, but with a penetrating gaze strong enough to make those insulting her realize they were facing something far greater than their shallow judgments. But what she saw wasn't just contempt. It was the consequence of a system allowed to persist for too long, where prejudice is disguised under the guise of procedure, and power is given to those who do not know how to wield it properly. At that moment, Danielle calmly pulled from her wallet a sleek black elite membership card, a shining metal piece any Aerostar employee was trained to recognize. At the same time, she presented her official ID, every detail matching the name in the system. But when Becky glanced at the card, she only sneered lightly. "We've seen plenty of fake cards. One card isn't enough to break the first-class rules." Jake quickly added, this time with a more overtly aggressive tone. "Exactly. A few plastic cards and confident looks don't fool us. First class isn't a place to show off." Those words weren't aimed only at Danielle. They were attacks on anyone who has ever tried to rise above prejudice, those stepping into spaces deemed not for them, and forced to prove their worth every single second. For Danielle, this was no stranger. But this time, she couldn't stand still. Not just for herself, but for the thousands of customers Aerostar had promised to serve fairly. She took a deep breath, maintaining her calm, then spoke gently but firmly. "I request my information be verified right now in your system." Becky lifted her head, her scornful gaze now turned into a challenge. "Either you leave this cabin," she said, "or I'll call airport security to escort you out." Her voice was unwavering. Her resolve, turning the cabin into a pin, dropped silence. Danielle knew this was no longer a personal insult. This was a pivotal moment where a decision would clearly mark the line between silent complicity and necessary outspokenness, and she was ready to cross that line. Not with anger, but with the truth. Just as Becky's firm threat ended, the heavy footsteps echoed from the front of the cabin, shattering the tense atmosphere like a tightly stretched rope snapping. Out of the cockpit stepped a middle-aged man, tall and broad, shouldered in a neat pilot's uniform, his cap pulled low to partially shade his stern eyes. Ronald Blake, the 54-year-old captain, a veteran of Aerostar, known as a symbol of iron discipline and a cold, distant leadership style. Without a word of greeting or assessing the situation, he immediately fixed a cutting gaze on Danielle, a look not for evaluation, but for exclusion. His voice rang out decisively, leaving no room for compromise. "Cease all arguments. This passenger must leave the plane immediately." No ticket check, no ID request, no review of evidence, just a command that cut through everything, as if the situation required no justification. In that moment, Becky seemed empowered. She curled her lips into a slight smile, her eyes sparkling with undisguised satisfaction. Jake tilted his head slightly, arms crossed as if watching a play whose ending he had already predicted. Moments later, Hannah Wells, an airport security officer, appeared at the cabin door. Dressed in Navy uniform, with a stun gun at her hip, her face was stern and expressionless. Hannah had once been a model of impartial professionalism, but now she approached as if following orders from those in power, not from the truth. "You have exactly 1 minute to leave the plane," Hannah said sharply, her tone slicing through any hope for fair treatment. Danielle did not flinch. She stood tall, her gaze fearless. Facing 3 representatives of authority, Becky, Ronald, and Hannah, she did not falter. Calmly, she said, "Before I leave, I request one last verification of my information. In your system." Her voice was not loud, but it was audible to everyone in the cabin. Ronald frowned, signaling to cut her off. "No time for games." Becky clenched her fists, as if eager to end this matter immediately. To their eyes, this was just a quick problem to solve. Someone who did not fit their prejudice and therefore must be removed. But Danielle knew every passing second was becoming evidence. Every action, every word was weaving a story none of them suspected would be exposed to the world. She did not need to shout or threaten. She only needed to let them reveal their true nature. And when the truth came to light, their power would collapse on its own, without her lifting a finger. The first-class cabin fell into a heavy silence. Not the usual elegant quiet, but a suffocating tension, the kind of atmosphere that only appears when what is right is being pushed to the brink of wrong. Becky maintained her arrogant stance. Jake stood with arms crossed, satisfied. Ronald coldly turned away, as if he had already passed the final verdict. Hannah tightened her grip on the radio at her side, eyes waiting for a last move from the passenger forced to leave. But just then, amid the circle of power surrounding Danielle, a weak yet trembling voice rose from behind. I think the ticket scanning system confirmed it's valid." The voice was barely audible, even drowned out by the air conditioner's hum and the clicking of keyboards from some passengers pretending not to care. But it was like a small crack on an otherwise perfect glass, enough to change everything. All eyes instantly turned toward the source of the voice. It was Rachel Kim, a young flight attendant still new on the job for less than a month, her youthful face flushed with nervousness, hands gripping the edge of the seat to keep herself from trembling. Rachel was not brave by conventional standards. She had never contradicted a superior colleague before. But Danielle's gaze, calm, steadfast, and full of trust, had touched something deep inside her. When everyone else chose to stand aside, Rachel knew that if she stayed silent too, she would never be able to hold her head high again. Becky snapped her head around instantly, her eyes sharp as knives, voice filled with threat. "Rachel, you're new here. Best not to interfere." Jake sneered, shaking his head as if looking at a child who didn't know what she was doing. Ronald ignored it, pretending not to hear. Rachel bowed her head briefly, her whole body trembling slightly. She knew that just one more word could end the career she had just begun to touch. But when she lifted her head, she was no longer the timid flight attendant. Her eyes met Danielle's, eyes full of gratitude, but not pleading. That gave her enough courage to continue, this time clearly and without hesitation. "I don't want to cause trouble, but I really see that the system has confirmed her ticket. We should check again, at least once." A gentle wave of murmurs spread from the nearby rows. Some passengers began whispering to each other. Some nodded, others looked at Becky with suspicion. For a moment, the absolute power held by the flight crew began to crack. Becky stepped closer to Rachel, her voice lowered as a final warning. "Remember your place, you're just a trainee. Don't let a moment of impulsiveness ruin everything." Rachel did not respond, but she did not take her eyes off Danielle. In that gaze was now a flicker of hope, fragile, but enough to light up the airplane cabin, slowly sinking into the darkness of injustice. And Danielle knew, from that moment on, she was no longer alone. Change, no matter how small, always begins with someone daring to speak up. Rachel's words, simple but steadfast, ignited a spark that illuminated the simmering unrest beneath the calm surface. No one in the first-class cabin spoke immediately, but the silence had shifted in nature. It was no longer cowardly complicity, but a sign of something stirring, a doubt quietly kindling in every gaze. In the third row from the left window, Lena Price, 36, a well-known social justice blogger, attuned to the smallest signs of power abuse, had been watching the entire incident since Danielle boarded. Beside her was David Chen, 29, a sharp-eyed young entrepreneur who had long since closed his laptop and was now observing intently with a face half frustrated, half contemplative. As Rachel spoke, the two exchanged a look that conveyed a shared understanding, that silence now was betrayal. Without a word more, Lena pulled out her phone, opened the camera, and began recording. No commentary, no staging, just simply capturing. Danielle's calm face, Becky's cold arrogance, Ronald's indifference, and Rachel's trembling but courageous voice. At the same time, David also took out his phone. His shot from behind created a perfect contrast, exposing everything, tone, glance, and the way power tried to enforce silence. No one asked them to film. Yet both Lena and David knew this moment needed to be preserved, not only as evidence, but as a reminder of the truth that sometimes justice begins with a handheld camera and a tap on upload. And that is exactly what they did moments after capturing the first clip. Lena posted the video on her social media account with a simple yet powerful hashtag, #Aerostar Scandal. David did the same, matching hashtag, and determined silence. Within minutes, views skyrocketed, then tens, hundreds, and within less than 10 minutes, thousands had witnessed the first moments of an incident that initially seemed just a flight mishap. The online community erupted with comments. "Unbelievable. She's their CEO and treated like this. If this can happen to her, what must ordinary people endure?" All this unfolded while the cabin remained tense, waiting for a move from those in power. But Becky and Ronald were still unaware. They were losing control every second. Danielle, meeting Lena and David's eyes, simply nodded. A nod not of thanks, but an affirmation that the truth had begun to speak. And this time, that voice came from those they could no longer control. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had completely changed. The whispers were no longer evasive murmurs, but small conversations mixed with dissatisfaction. Some passengers began to pull out their phones, not to scroll through emails or market news, but to check if the video they had just witnessed was truly spreading as powerfully as the unease growing inside them. Meanwhile, Becky still tried to maintain her composure, but her eyes no longer held their former firmness. Ronald, despite wearing the distinguished Aerostar uniform, began to sense the cracks beneath his polished shoes. Amid the storm, Danielle remained remarkably calm. No complaints, no accusations, just the quiet strength of someone who knew justice didn't need to be shouted. It simply needed to be called at the right time. And that's exactly what she did. From inside her coat pocket, Danielle took out her phone, operating it with one hand, slow but sure. She didn't need to look at the screen. Each tap was etched into her memory after years of leading the company through far more challenging situations. She called Stephanie Lau, a senior assistant and the only executive aware of this silent plan. Her voice was soft but resolute, loud enough for those nearby, including Becky and Ronald, to hear every word. Stephanie, inform the board of directors. Tell them to review the spreading video. I'm ready for the next instructions. At that moment, the phone ceased to be a mere communication tool. It became a symbol of legitimate power. Becky let out a dry, mocking laugh. She stepped forward, crossing her arms, and whispered sarcastically, "Calling the cops? Here, we're the only ones who give orders." Danielle didn't reply. She didn't need to. Immediately after, the phone rang. A deep, clear, authoritative male voice silenced everyone intending to speak. "Danielle, this is Thomas Green from the board. We have seen the video. The entire executive committee is in an emergency meeting. You have full authority to handle the situation as you see fit." Those words rang like a death knell to all false assumptions. Becky froze. Her smile instantly vanished. Ronald clenched the nearest chair as if holding on to something to keep his balance. Jake, though still trying to appear calm, began looking down, avoiding everyone's gaze. Danielle lowered the phone. Her expression remained unchanged, but now her gaze was no longer that of a passenger insulted. It was that of a person holding the power to decide the careers, dignity, and futures of all who had chosen wrongly in that seemingly unnoticed moment. They had misjudged the wrong person. And now it was her turn to decide who would stay on this flight and who would not. The confirming words from Thomas Green, his voice one that any senior Aerostar employee could instantly recognize, sent the entire cabin into a stunned silence, as if all sound had been drained from the space. No further explanation was needed, no loud declarations necessary. Only one thing remained. The truth laid bare, stark and unforgiving, like a beam of light exposing a hidden fault. Becky stepped back half a pace, her eyes wide with confusion, no longer able to hide her panic. The confident, arrogant mask she had worn since the start of the flight shattered into pieces. She looked around, searching for an ally, a helping hand. But Jake was staring at the floor. Ronald had turned away. And the passengers, they were no longer spectators. They had become witnesses. Ronald Blake, the captain famed for his decisiveness and iron principles, now gripped the back of a seat like a man realizing an irreversible mistake. His face was pale, the tension etched clearly across his temples. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The authority of a man who had commanded thousands of flights was now bent and broken by a decision too hasty, too cold, and utterly wrong. Jake, the man who always hid behind mocking smiles, stood silent, his arms hanging loosely by his sides. No one heard his mocking laughter anymore. His silence was no longer defiance, but an undeniable fear, like a child who suddenly realizes he has been playing with fire without knowing the danger. Meanwhile, Danielle stood firm in her place. No step back, no sign of compromise. She simply lifted her head and met each person's gaze, not with hatred, but with the judgment of someone holding the truth and ready to face its consequences. Then she spoke. No raised voice, no theatrics. Each word cut through the air like a carved inscription. Anyone involved in discrimination, insult, and abuse of power on this flight is terminated immediately. You have 5 minutes to leave the aircraft. No one replied. Becky looked at Danielle, lips moving as if to say something, a justification, an apology, or simply a plea for mercy. But when her eyes met Danielle's, calm, unangry, yet absolutely resolute, she understood that words were now meaningless. No one believed her any more. Worse, no one stood with her. Ronald nodded softly, like a man finally accepting defeat. Jake turned and walked away swiftly, as if to escape the gaze of everyone present. Meanwhile, several passengers began pulling out their phones to record this historic moment, not to shame those about to be dismissed, but to preserve evidence that justice, though delayed, can still arrive in time. Danielle glanced at the clock. The second hand moved steadily, as if counting down to a moment of closure. Deep down, she knew, this was not just the end for 3 individuals, but the beginning of profound change for the entrutzer culture of Aerostar. As Becky, Ronald, and Jake bowed their heads, gathering their belongings under the watchful eyes of the entire cabin, it seemed the story had come to a rightful close. Yet at that very moment, a soft voice rose from the back of the cabin, not loud, not commanding, but enough to make everyone pause. "Miss Danielle." All heads turned. It was Rachel, the young flight attendant who had bravely spoken up earlier. Her face still showed traces of tension, but this time there was something different. Her eyes sparkled with a newfound determination. Her trembling hand pulled a phone from her uniform pocket, and she took a few steps forward, stopping before Danielle. I have evidence," Rachel said, voice quiet but firm. "I accidentally overheard a conversation between Becky and Jake before you boarded. They talked about deleting your seat information from the system so they'd have a valid reason to force you out of first class." No one moved. No one spoke. Everything froze in that moment, before the truth was fully revealed. Danielle nodded calmly, as always. "Can you let everyone hear it?" Rachel swallowed hard and played the recording. A faint static crackled. Then Becky's cold, steady voice echoed. "Just delete her name from the list. A simple edit. No one checks." Next came Jake's sneering laugh. "She dresses like that. Who'd believe she's a first-class passenger? A black woman in plain clothes. Too easy to dismiss." The recording ended in complete silence. No more doubt. No more conflicting words. The truth had spoken, undeniable. Passengers around began murmuring. Some covered their mouths in shock. Others exchanged angry looks. A middle-aged man muttered, "Unbelievable," while an elderly woman shook her head, tears streaming, not out of sadness, but because, finally, the truth had a voice. Danielle looked at Rachel. No need for words of thanks. The respectful nod she gave was enough for Rachel to understand her small act had helped change a giant organization. Becky now could barely stand. She slumped into the nearest seat, clutching her head as if wanting to disappear from the world's view. Jake was silent, eyes red, rimmed, while Ronald, the once confident captain of hundreds of crews, stood motionless like a man judged in a court he never thought he'd face mid-flight. Danielle turned to face the entire cabin, speaking clearly for the first time to all. "We have just witnessed a painful but necessary moment. From today forward, Aerostar will never tolerate such behavior ever again." Applause broke out, at first sparse, then gradually spreading. Not a loud cheer, but a quiet ovation from those once powerless, now reclaiming faith in justice. And in that first-class cabin, an airline began its rebirth from the very heart of truth. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin thickened as Danielle calmly turned to Security Officer Hannah, her voice warm, yet absolutely firm. "Hannah, fulfill your duty. Escort these people off the plane. This is no longer a request. It is an official order." For a moment, Hannah froze. She looked at Danielle, then at the three standing motionless. Becky bowed her head. Ronald was stunned. Jake dared not lift his eyes. She swallowed hard and nodded decisively, silently pledging she understood. The rules were no longer in the hands of those who abused their power. Becky was the first to stagger forward, her legs trembling as if drained of strength. Years of authority and discipline now reduced to a silent shadow, slowly slipping toward the exit. Ronald, once responsible for hundreds of lives each flight, bowed his head and followed, his face pale as if he no longer recognized himself. Jake gave a slight nod to Danielle before leaving, not an apology, but acceptance of an undeniable truth. The three departed the cabin in utter silence, yet every step they took was a moral sentence no court could ever pronounce clearer. When the door closed behind them, Hannah remained beside Danielle, her eyes full of remorse. "I almost made a mistake," she whispered. "I'm ready to accept discipline." But Danielle looked at her with compassion and firmness. "Aerostar will not tolerate wrongdoing, but we do not refuse those who take responsibility a chance to make things right. Let's start anew and do better." Hannah nodded, her eyes glistening. She knew she had just been saved, not only from a mistake, but from the old ways that had silenced her. Danielle stepped into the center of the cabin, facing all the passengers for the first time. "I sincerely apologize to all of you. What you witnessed today is a shame, but also a beginning. Aerostar will reform. There will be no place for discrimination, no place for silence. From today, we commit to building an airline where every passenger is respected for their own human value." All eyes turned to her, no longer doubtful, only understanding and agreement. Then, as a sincere reflex, applause broke out, sparse at first, then growing into long, vibrant rounds. Amidst that space, Rachel, the one who had changed the course with her courage, stood quietly, her hands trembling with emotion. Danielle approached and placed a hand on her shoulder. "From this moment, you are no longer a trainee flight attendant. You are the embodiment of Aerostar's spirit, and we need more people like you." Rachel was choked with emotion, speechless. She bowed in thanks to the resounding applause from the entire cabin. Danielle smiled and returned to her seat. No words, no declarations needed. The passengers quietly made way for her. No one questioned who she was anymore, because now the whole world knew. It's cool. Danielle Moore, the woman who needed no power to wield power, the one who turned a flight into a milestone of rebirth, not just for Aerostar, but for all who believe that truth and courage can rewrite the definition of justice. As an experienced leader in human resources and corporate culture, I believe that an organization does not collapse because of major violations right from the start, but because of small actions ignored, repeated in silence, accumulating into a culture. Conversely, just one person daring to stand up, one person wise enough to look at the root instead of blaming the surface, can bring an inter-system back to life. Danielle Moore's story is not just a shock to Aerostar, but a powerful reminder to all of us. Sometimes true power does not come from position, but from steadfast commitment to the right values: fairness, respect, and courage. If you believe that a courageous act can change an entire community, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel to help spread more stories about responsibility and rebirth in the workplace. And before you go, please leave a comment with the phrase "No silence" as a pledge that the right voice always deserves to be heard.